Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Emily Ferrier, here to bring you some uplifting stories in these trying times. Our first story, Nebraska doctor lets patients pay for surgery by volunteering. With around 43 million Americans under 65 past due on medical bills yearly in the U.S. medical debt totaling $88 billion. One surgeon in Nebraska is offering to eliminate debt for his patients, as long as they agree to pay it forward. Surgeon Demetrio Aguila saw a recurring problem in his clinic of Healing Hands of Nebraska. Patients who couldn't afford surgery. So, 6 months ago, the nerve specialist started a program that offers patients the option to pay for surgery by volunteering for local humanitarian groups. We can't ignore the people in our own backyard, he told CBS News correspondent Meg Oliver. We want to be able to offer hope to patients who have lost hope medically. About 10% of Aguila's patients qualify for the program. He and his staff calculate the number of volunteer hours required based on the complexity of surgery. I don't care if you're a multi-billionaire or if you're the guy on the street corner with a styrofoam cup. You could offer the same options. Why? Because it's fair, he said. The arrangement seemed more than fair to Troy Bowers and his wife Bobby. Medical debt took them to the brink of bankruptcy, so they agreed to pay for Troy's ankle surgery by volunteering at a local charity where clothing and household goods are donated. Jeff Jensen also signed on. He has nerve damage in his feet and worried about paying for his procedure. There's nothing more depressing than seeing a bill for $18,000, $20,000, $24,000 and going, how much of this will my insurance cover and how much is mine to cover? Jensen said. Jensen's surgery added up to 560 hours of volunteering, but others are allowed to help. For him, more than 100 people stepped up to contribute. Out of those 105, I probably knew 30 or 40 of them, Jensen said. Really, without this program, the surgery wouldn't have been done. Aguila hopes that his mission will inspire more doctors to find creative ways to limit their patients' medical expenses. This whole practice is about restoring hope for patients by giving them the opportunity to wrest back control of their health care, he said. Right now this program is small, with just 8 people, but Aguila said once he started, his stress levels have gone down, and his job satisfaction has soared. We've talked about generosity and giving back on this podcast a lot. I think that this particular story is no exception. Aguila, this Nebraska doctor, has been so giving in his time and in his efforts, but he's expecting people to give back, and I think that that's the right way to go. I think that often in America, the idea of medicine often is overlooked by people who benefit from great insurance companies and great great doctors that they are provided by the companies that they work for, and they often forget about the people that maybe don't have this incredible insurance and aren't taking advantage of these programs, and they forget that for some people, this isn't just a simple, cold or something like that. It really is life or death. And I think that what he's doing is absolutely incredible. I think more doctors should be doing things like this. I hope that this story spreads quite a bit. I really like the idea of someone paying forward something that was gifted to them so nicely. And we're going to talk about this a lot on the pod today. So stay tuned for that. I really, really liked this story. And if anybody has any stories like this, or they know any other medical professionals that are doing things like this, please let us know in the comments, because I think this would be really useful for people that need it. So if you do, write in. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about some other generosity from the Good Samaritans, a volunteer-based phone system that helps with suicide prevention, if you don't know. So we're going to talk about a really beautiful story of sort of a reunion because of the suicide hotline. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we return from the break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Before the break, we were talking about the generosity of a Nebraska surgeon. Now, we're going to talk about an interesting story about the Good Samaritans. In a strange twist of fate, this suicide hotline volunteer only recently discovered that she'd spent the last 4 years working next to the man who talked her through her own suicidal crisis. 60-year-old Georgina Laurie contemplated taking her own life 7 years ago after enduring the sudden death of her husband, Dennis. A year prior to that, I had a stroke, so my whole life had completely changed, and I couldn't cope with that, said Laurie. I got really depressed, really down, and I really couldn't see that there was a way forward for me. Thankfully, a fateful phone conversation with a volunteer from the Samaritans, an international nonprofit dedicated to preventing suicide, was enough to help her change her mind, put one foot in front of the other, and keep going. I had no intention of ringing Samaritans and no intention of ringing and telling anybody, said Laurie. I was in bed. I was coughing, dribbled water. I went to my bedside, and the Samaritan's card flicked out. That's a nice little moment of fate right there, isn't it? I hadn't really considered them at all, and I thought, I'll give them a call. And it wasn't to be talked out of what I was doing. I wanted the universe to know what I was doing. I didn't leave a note or anything. So I phoned up, and this gentleman answered, and for an hour listened to me wittering on, and I know I was talking about the difficulties in my family since my husband died. It was really difficult. I told him what I was going to do. He didn't judge me. There was no judgment. There was no trying to change my mind. I felt completely that I could trust him and open up. For an hour I was wittering away, but still determined to go through what I'd planned. I decided I'd chatted enough, and I said, I'm going to go now. And at that point, the Samaritan said to me, I would just like to say one thing. This all sounds totally exhausting. And I hadn't thought about that, and I thought, yeah, you're right. I am exhausted. And I'm emotionally and physically exhausted. And then I put the phone down. I started to think, if I'm exhausted, am I really that mentally and emotionally exhausted? Am I making the right decision? And it was enough just to get me thinking. The experience eventually inspired the English grandmother from Kent to begin volunteering for the organization so she could help those going through the same kind of despair. About 2.5 years after the phone call, Lori decided to join the Samaritans, which had around 60 volunteers. She's since risen through the ranks of the organization and began mentoring the volunteers on how they can get involved. She spent 4.5 years working in a booth alongside branch director and longtime volunteer Des McCarthy, although she only discovered it was him who talked her through her troubles. Lori had been in the middle of an evening shift when she suddenly had an epiphany over the identity of her anonymous savior. It was about 5 months ago. I was training one of my mentees, and my mentee was on the phone, so I had more time to listen to what Des was saying, albeit subconsciously. I suddenly heard Des say, "It must have been exhausting for you." And I was transferred back to all those years. I couldn't believe it. It was really one of those serendipitous moments, and I realized that it was Des I'd spoken to. I couldn't bring myself to say anything that night. We were actually at another volunteer's birthday party, and I'd confided in another volunteer and said, here's an ideal opportunity to tell him. And it just organically came out. Lori's call could have been diverted to any of the Samaritan call centers, and the fact that McCarthy was the call handler was completely random. I don't have a stock of phrases, said McCarthy. Some people will have a comfort in using stock phrases when they begin, but I don't think I ever had. It's not something I say very often at all. McCarthy's a former police officer, and he's stepping down in his role as director after 3 years and passing it on to Lori, who will be taking over next month. It just seems like the natural little process. It was so humbling to be asked. I think it's a nice all-around story about someone who's been in despair, who did call the Samaritans. Des didn't try to talk me out of doing anything, said Lori. All he did was do what we say on the tin. We listen, and listening is enough sometimes. I want to emphasize how important this story is to me and how important I think this story is to anyone dealing with mental health. There are always people willing to listen and people willing to talk to you. You are important. Your life is worth it. And if you are struggling with these negative thoughts, I really, really urge you to reach out to a service like the Samaritans. Suicide hotline, suicide prevention. They are all available to you. Please, please, please call. Please talk to someone. It's absolutely worth it. And just this moment of thought can save your life. And look how it's turned Lori's life around. Just this moment, this interaction with McCarthy turned her life around so much that she's now the one preventing others from this horrible, horrible tragedy. I think this story is absolutely beautiful of coming around full circle. And we've heard these stories in the past. There was one recently with a premature baby that ended up reconnecting with the nurse that saved him as a baby. And now we have this. And I do think that this is just as important of a medical interaction Remember that mental illness is also a medical condition, and you need to seek help and you need to talk to people about it. So I really loved this story. I thought it was really, really beautiful, and the idea of human connection and just people helping other people get through the hard times. So thank you so much for listening to that story. When we return from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about human generosity. This is about a server at an Ethiopian restaurant getting a very, very generous tip that they were asked to pay it forward. So we're going to continue this theme with paying it forward when we return.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about some amazing people over at the Good Samaritans. And now we go to Cleveland Heights, Ohio, where a very, very generous person was dining at a restaurant and left something very, very generous as a pay it forward. So a server at Zoma Ethiopian restaurant in Cleveland Heights got a very generous tip of $400 along with a note to pay it forward. In the note, the customer said to give a portion of the tip to another server who helped and a portion in the staff at the back of the restaurant. Great food. I loved the music and culture. I got a big portion of food for a reasonable price. And in the note, the customer said the server should pay the rest forward to help pay for school and pay the rest forward. The owner said it just shows how wonderful his restaurant's customers are. So I wanted to look more into the notion of paying it forward, and I found a nice article about paying it forward from political scientist Elizabeth Bartlett, who's a professor of political science at Midwestern University. At the age of 42, her irregular heartbeat had become life-threatening. And as a heart transplant was her last hope, she was fortunate to receive one. Now, she felt thankful she had this new lease on life, but she felt like being thankful wasn't quite enough. I have a desire to give something in return, to do thanks, to give thanks, give things, give thoughts, give love. So gratitude becomes the gift, creating a cycle of giving and receiving, the endless waterfall, filling up and spilling over. Perhaps not even to the giver, but to someone else, to whoever crosses one's path. It's the simple passing on of the gift. What Bartlett describes as true gratitude. As this illustrates, gratitude is more than a pleasant feeling. It's also motivating. Gratitude serves as a key link between receiving and giving. It moves recipients to share and increase the very good that they've received. Because so much of human life is about giving and receiving and repaying. Gratitude is a pivotal concept for our social interactions. the famed sociologist George Simmel declared that the gratitude, the moral memory of humankind. If every grateful action, he went on to say, were suddenly eliminated, society would crumble. So why is gratitude so good? For two main reasons. Gratitude strengthens social ties. It cultivates an individual sense of interconnectedness. The second reason is supporting the power of gratitude is that gratitude increases one's sense of personal worth. When we experience gratitude, we understand that another person wishes us well, and in turn, we feel loved and cared for. This example of the diner and the extreme tip is a small example of gratitude and paying it forward. What I hope is that this server and the other people that worked at the restaurant really took on the sense of gratitude and paying it forward and continue to put it out in the world. I really do think that the things that you put out are the things that you receive. And learning a little bit more about gratitude and what it means to a person, and this idea of gratitude making you feel really loved and cared for, and as we heard from the Good Samaritan story, it can really save a person's life. So I hope that you guys liked these stories about gratitude, because we're going to talk about another example of sort of paying it forward in a little George Bailey kind of way of everyone coming together to help a woman who was robbed of her life savings. So we're going to talk about that when we come back from the break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we talked about some gratitude and paying it forward. And now we're going to talk about another sort of story of people coming together to help out and this idea of paying it forward. So this happened after a 95-year-old woman was robbed of her life savings. Her community managed to replace it all by serving spaghetti. Last summer, Barbara Hinckley's bank accounts were emptied of about $16,000 after she was targeted by a con man who convinced her that she'd won second place in a publisher clearinghouse contest with a prize of $2.5 million and a Mercedes-Benz. The senior from Auburn later told news reporters about the scam in hopes that it would deter other people from falling prey to the same scheme. So this is what I mean by paying it forward. She called in to warn other people about this. So she was giving out into the universe this thing that had happened to her, just in the hopes that other people wouldn't have the same thing happen to them back. She wasn't expecting anything. So a gentleman named John Baltacci heard about the incident in November. However, he was spurred to help. Stealing from the elderly is not the main way, said he at the Bangor Daily News. Let's turn something bad into something positive by showing the world our true main character. So John then spearheaded the spaghetti dinner fundraiser earlier this month with 60 pounds of noodles, 17 gallons of sauce, and dozens of cases of vegetables. He told the Sun-Journal that his goal was not to have any food left over by the end of the night. Over 400 people attended the fundraiser, and they raised an amazing $18,000, which is even more than what Hinckley was swindled of. Hinckley's daughter, Marcia Donahue, told the Press-Herald that she and the rest of her family were amazed by the people's compassion during the dinner. From an unexpected $1,000 checks to the obviously financially struggling people that gave extra above their tickets, I've been bowled over by the people's generosity, said Donahue. It's been a roller coaster ride for her, and for us in the family too, from the destitution to the solvency. Hinckley also said that her story could serve as a warning for others. Again, she's not really thinking of herself, even in these awful times. She was thinking of others. She reassured the reporters that she will no longer be allowed to spend any of her new life savings without first getting her family's permission. I love this idea of the state of Maine getting together to help out with getting this woman's money back after getting swindled away. I really think it's so awful that these scam artists are going around and taking advantage of the elderly who might not know about all of these schemes that are out there, or just might not want to believe that people have become so awful towards other people. But even amongst this awful scam, this beautiful thing came out of this community, and I think that that's really, really amazing. And I really applaud the people of Maine, and particularly John, for putting that together. I really think that's lovely. So after the break, we're going to talk about the environment. So it's a little bit different than most of the stories that we've been talking about generosity and paying it forward, but it is still a little bit on theme of paying it forward, and that if you do, you're going to be receiving something amazing from the state of Minnesota, but you're paying it forward in that you're keeping the environment going, which would be nice. Speaking as a person in the world that would like the environment to continue. So we're going to talk about what Minnesota is doing for people and homeowners when we return.
Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you.
Break, we were talking about the generosity of the state of Maine, and now we're going to Minnesota, where Minnesota has proposed that they will pay homeowners to replace their lawns with bee-friendly wildflowers, clover, and native grasses. So they've allocated nearly $1 million in incentives for people to transform their lawns. They've asked citizens to stop spraying herbicide, stop mowing so often, and let their lawns rewild into a more natural state. The goal is to provide food sources for pollinators of all kinds, but specifically aim at saving those rusty patch bumblebee, a fat, fuzzy species on the brink of extinction that seems to be making its final stand in the city of the upper Midwest. Research has shown that bumblebees are particularly important to the region, as they vibrate at a frequency that unlocks pollen and other insects can't reach. The loss of the native prairies and forests across the county has made pollinators more dependent on urban and suburban lawn flowers, says James Wolfen, a bee habitat researcher at the University of Minnesota. His research is focused on bee lawns, grassy yards interspersed with small flowers such as the Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, self-heal, ground plume, and dandelions. So these flowers make excellent food sources for bees while being cheap to plant and easy to maintain. A pound of Dutch white clover is about $7 and grows large enough that people wouldn't even have to change the way that they mow their lawn, he told the Star Tribune. Around 55 of Minnesota's 350 bee species depend on this white clover alone. Just by not treating white clover like a weed and letting it grow in the yard provides a really powerful resource for nearly 20% of the bee species in the state. This program is set to begin in the spring of 2020, and citizens living in Rusty Patch Bumblebee zones are eligible for grants of up to $500 for just a $7 plant, while people living in the zones of secondary and tertiary importance to bees are eligible for $350 and $150 respectively. So considering as it's about $7 to $10 to spread these seeds, then that should be enough to cover it, and then much more. So as we need bees, we know that we need bees, we know they're in trouble, we need to protect their environments, and I think this is a really incredible way for Minnesota citizens to be able to do that. So that's very incredible, very, very good on you, Minnesota State, for implementing that. When we come back, I'm going to do a little bit of a twist on the positive news story roundup. I'm going to talk about some positive news stories that happened on this day in history when we return.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. So before we left, we talked about how Minnesota is making some huge steps with an incentive program to save the bees in their state. So now, as our final segment, instead of doing a roundup of my favorite news, which I normally do, I wanted to talk about some positive news stories that have happened historically on today's date. So keep in mind that this was recorded on January 30th, not 31st, so it will have changed by the time you're listening to this. But I wanted to talk about today anyway. So on today's date, Thomas Jefferson offered to restock the shelves of the Library of Congress, which had been destroyed in the War of 1812, selling Congress more than 6,000 books from his own library, twice as many as had been burned. And this happened in 1815 on January 30th. Another piece, the first massive suspension bridge opened in Wales, coastline reduced the 36-hour journey time from London to Holyhead by 9 hours. So that's incredible, very exciting stuff. That happened in 1826. I've actually been to the suspension bridge. It's absolutely beautiful and Absolutely massive. In 1911, on today's date, the first airplane rescue at sea happened near Cuba via USS Terry. That happened in 1911. Also, today is the 69th birthday of Phil Collins. If you don't know who Phil Collins is, I am so sorry about that. And my God, you really need to go listen to some Genesis right now. Lead singer of Genesis. Also, he created one of the best Disney soundtracks of all time, the Tarzan soundtrack. You're welcome. Go listen to it if you haven't heard it. What happened in 1995 on this date? The first successful trials to treat sickle cell disease took place at the U.S. National Institute of Health in 1995. In 2003, Belgium legally recognized same-sex marriage on this date. And in 2005, Iraqis voted on the first country's free election in half a century. So very exciting. That was in 2005. Another story. 75 years ago today, 500 Allied prisoners of war from the Britannia Death March were liberated during World War II from a Japanese prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. 121 U.S. Rangers, supported by several hundred Filipino guerrilla fighters, trekked 30 miles and then raided the prisoner camp using intelligence gained from Alamo scouts disguised as locals. The Great Raid lasted 30 minutes. This was in 1945. Absolutely beautiful moment in history. And one more little one that I really enjoyed. I really like the Beatles. I hope you do too. On this date in 1969, the Beatles played their last public concert. Very famous concert. I'm sure you've seen the stills from it at least, if not know lots about this. They performed on the rooftop of Apple Records, surprising lunchtime pedestrians on a blistery cold day. The group, which invited Billy Preston to sit on the keyboards, hadn't played in public for 3 years. The unannounced London appearance was eventually broken up by the police, but all of the memorable scenes, including people gazing up on the streets, were filmed for a documentary. A total of 9 takes of 5 songs: Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, and Dig a Pony. The Beatles realized that the concert would be shut down as the police ascended to the roof, but they continued to play for several more minutes. Paul McCartney improvised the lyrics of his song Get Back to reflect the situation. You've been playing on the roofs again, and you don't know your mama doesn't like it. She's gonna have you arrested. Very clever, very good improv on Sir Paul McCartney's part. The concert came to an end with the conclusion of Get Back, with John Lennon saying, I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves. I hope we've passed the audition. I'd say you did. I would say that they did. The Beatles are one of my favorite groups, so I really, obviously, I'm a person in this world, so I really liked this story, and I hope you guys did too. That was some history from today's date in good news from the past. So I hope you guys have really enjoyed this one. A lot about gratitude, a lot about paying it forward, some things that I really care and I'm really passionate about. And yeah, so this is the end of the episode. There is beauty in America. Let's try harder to see it. Thank you for listening to the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. And please rate the episode. That really, really helps us boost in the numbers. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you so much, and have a great night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from social media news to marketing news, and even weird news, the GSMC Podcast Network has you covered. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast.